Joining me now from Washington DC is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Thank you very much for your time on Saturday Agenda. What is the cause for the optimism that the Treasurer has been talking about this week?
Well, the cause for the optimism, David, really comes down to a couple of things. The first is that it's been a very successful year for Australia and in particular for the Treasurer as President of the G20. We've achieved and set the bar pretty high back in February when we had the first finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, when we committed as G20 member states to growing global growth by an additional 2%. Now, we already have in place reforms that the G20 member states have committed to, which the IMF has said will add to global growth 1.8%. And we're looking to bed down the last few reforms that will make us achieve that 2% growth target in time for the Leaders' Summit. So that's really good news. And the second reason is, David, of course, because of the important economic stewardship that the Treasurer and the Prime Minister are taking here in Australia to make sure that we get our nation back on track, that we deal with Labor's debt problem, that we undertake the kind of important structural reform that's going to mean that we stop stealing from the next generation of Australians to pay for today's spending and actually start to live within our means.
Setting a goal of 2% growth is one thing. Achieving it is something else, particularly in the climate that I was just referring to in the globe. Is it realistic for the world to achieve these targets over the next few years?
I really think it is, David. I mean, the simple fact is that the modelling that's been done by the International Monetary Fund shows that the reforms that have been put forward, and there's only 900 of which, out of the 900 global reforms, about 700 of them are new. So the IMF has done that modelling, and the IMF says that as a direct consequence of the very high bar that Australia has set and that the rest of the world is stepping up to, we look at increasing global growth by 1.8%, and as I said, we're hopeful that we'll get that last 0.2% to reach the 2% ambition by the Leaders' Summit in November. So there really is a strong commitment, and if anything, David, what we're seeing in terms of global volatility, what we're seeing in terms of the slowdown in Europe, it just underscores even more how crucial it is that we go for growth as a nation, and that really is at the epicentre of what Australia is doing with our economic action plan.
Infrastructure is a really important part of all of this. What's being done to ensure that it's quality infrastructure, it's the right infrastructure? Because we have seen some pretty bad examples in China, for example, bridges to nowhere, highways to towns that don't have any people in them.
Well, look, you hear reports about that. In an Australian context, of course, the government's already outlined a number of key infrastructure projects that we are committed to delivering. We took those to the election, and we also, of course, announced in the budget the largest infrastructure package that Australia has ever seen. We'll see between both government spending and the private sector some $125 billion or thereabouts invested in productive infrastructure in Australia over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, David, this underscores this government's commitment to making our economy more productive, to getting jobs growth out there in the Australian community, to making sure that we've got a strong and stable platform that we can drive Australia's domestic growth from. And this underscores what we want to achieve. Now, obviously, different countries will make different decisions about what they want to do in terms of infrastructure, but we are leading the way. We are infrastructure champions. We see it as crucial to our long-term national good economic health.
What about some of the volatility in relation to the Middle East, Ebola? How much of an impact are issues like that going to have on these targets? And how are issues like that being viewed by the G20 leaders?
Well, you know, it's been interesting, David. I've had a number of conversations with people from around the globe over the last couple of days. And indeed,
OK, we've clearly lost our line to Steve Ciobo. Apologies for that. We will endeavour to try and get that up for you. He has, of course, been meeting various world leaders, as you just heard him say, in Washington DC, along with the Treasurer, Joe Hockey. Thank you very much for your company here on Saturday Agenda. The news is coming up next after this break.